Hey everyone, a really warm welcome back to the channel, and please excuse the nasally sound for a few minutes. My darling, caring, sharing children have indeed shared something from school. Thankfully not coronavirus, just a bad cold, but it surely did wipe me out for a couple of days. Anyway, on the way back up now, and incredibly keen to get this video finished so I can share it with you. So hopefully you'll excuse me for that. And as you'll have seen from the little time indicator bar below, yes, that really is correct. This is not your standard YouTube video. This probably breaks all the YouTube guidance out there, actually, for how to make good YouTube videos. But frankly, I don't care, because I think the reason our little Twitter and YouTube and Instagram and so on community around motorhomes and caravans and camper vans and so on, I think the reason that works so well is there's so many different people in there with such a range of skills and expertise and so on that are willing to share them, that it's fantastic. You know, I have learnt so much from other people. I'll be forever grateful for that. It's, you know, really helped a huge amount, both technically and in terms of, you know, arrival videos, getting to places and tours of sites and all that sort of stuff. So helpful. And that was the motivation for me starting my channel, you know, trying to contribute some unique things from my point of view and some of the little projects that I've been working on, as well as trip videos and all that sort of stuff. And one of my skills is supposed to be, or it was many years ago, anyway, it's supposed to be science and, you know, being able to take a technical topic and understand it at a basic level, you know, from an amateur's point of view, a user's point of view, if it's not specifically in what I spent years training in, but being able to apply that to solving problems. And that was one of the motivations behind this video. So as a caravan owner, I saw so much chatter on how I should be storing the caravan in the winter. And, you know, frankly, there were so many opinions. Goodness only knows what's true. So I wanted to apply some science to this very question and see what the data showed us. So today's video is all about a really in-depth look at what the experiment was that I did, how I set it up, how I use the various instrumentations, and then we'll go through the data together so that you can see in detailed format how I come to the conclusions that I do. And I didn't want to do that a disservice by just, you know, bish bash bosh through the data, but I wanted to share the whole process with you. So I hope you don't mind the long video. There are, of course, chapter headings for folks that can't stand an hour and a bit of data and science and so on. But for anybody that does, I'll be eternally grateful for your viewing. You know, it's great to have at least a couple of people who are prepared to view it, having taken the time to put it together. You guys will probably need a cup of tea, a selection of snacks, and possibly a comfort stop halfway through. But once you're ready, let's get going with what Graham, the caravan vlogger, will no doubt describe as the most Becky-like video ever. So let's go. Hey everyone, a really warm welcome back to the channel and welcome to the caravan. You guys are on the iPad, so I hope this is going to work okay, and I hope the sound's going to be okay, because we do live next to a really quite busy road, and there's a school down the road, and it's chucking out time for the school, so who knows what sort of engine noises and squeals and so on there'll be in the background. Anyway, back when I first got the caravan, the first winter we went through, and I really thought, what am I supposed to be doing here? Am I supposed to be putting desiccator crystals in? Am I supposed to be having the heating on? How on earth am I supposed to look after this thing? Or do I just leave it sat where it is? Because after all, that's what dealerships do. Anyway, I made the mistake of going online. And of course, there's a perennial yearly discussion, argument. Well, anyway, there are some very strongly held opinions forcefully expressed sometimes, and there are the absolute converts who insist you must have desiccator crystals in. There are those that insist nothing other than heating will do, or dehumidifiers, and probably an equal number of voices that say that's all complete load of tosh. You know, why on earth do you do anything? Because the dealerships don't. And of course there's the covers question as well. And that really confused me. I thought, what on earth am I supposed to do? And I suspect I'm one of many people sitting quietly watching all this discussion going on, just feeling confused and thinking, what on earth are we going to do? Well, once upon a time, I was allegedly a practicing scientist, although that's been many years now. So I thought, well, for goodness sake, you know, there's a set of variables. there's a question to be solved, so surely we can do something about this. So before we get bogged down in data and results and things, a couple of disclaimers. So as I said, once upon a time I was allegedly a practicing scientist who knew what they were doing, but I'm the wrong type of scientist. So if you're a heating or ventilation or human occupation of building specialist, then certainly at least you guys should regard this as a rather amateurish attempt to work out what on earth's going on in this caravan. For everybody else, bear in mind that it's been many years since I was in the lab. Anyway, second disclaimer, I'm not using lab grade equipment. You know, I'm just using common or garden stuff that's available to everyone. So the sensors I'll show you in a minute came off of Amazon. They're designed to be used in museum exhibit cases, so you know, the sort of things where you have to be very careful what humidity and temperature and so on you're storing your artifacts at, or they can be used in wine cellars for checking the humidity around barrels of wine. Not that I have many barrels of wine. I don't know how many people who buy from Amazon have many barrels of wine. Anyway, that's another use for the things. So they're about £10 a piece. They are certainly not thousands and thousands of pounds worth of really accurate scientific equipment. So we'll come to accuracies and errors and so on in a minute. So bear that in mind. They are, however, extremely user-friendly and easy to use because they're Bluetooth sensors, so I can get them talking to my phone and sit in the comfort of my house and monitor what's going on in the caravan, which is stored just outside the house on our small drive. There's just enough room for the caravan and the couple of cars because the caravan is so small. One of the main reasons for buying one this small. Yeah, storage costs around here are manic. They were about £1,000 when I looked into it. But anyway, that is a side moan. Right, so third disclaimer. As you'll see later, there were lots of different scenarios that I wanted to run through. So I wanted to answer questions around desiccator crystals and dehumidifiers. So just a mini dehumidifier. Again, I'll show you a picture of that when we talk about it in a minute. And heating. I've got the Truma Combi 4E system, so I can just set that with a dial just there to the lowest setting, which I assume is frost protect. I have no idea before I carried out the experiment what temperature that's set at, but so that on the minimum setting. Or these windows, so either having them completely closed like you would normally, or on the vent setting, so just the one click open that you would when you were using the caravan as part of the normal ventilation cycle. So that's 4 different variables in terms of how the caravan's stored. I don't have a cover, so I wasn't able to check the cover. I would love to do that as a follow-up, so if anybody wants to sponsor a covers vlog, then send me your cover and I will rerun the experiments with the cover on and the cover off, and we'll see if that makes any difference to the humidity inside, because that is one of the things that are discussed as well. But I'm not spending several £100s on a cover just to get some data for a video. The channel cannot support that sort of investment. Right. Is that all the disclaimers? No. So the point of all those scenarios is that I wanted to run each of the scenarios for a decent amount of time to make sure that the caravan was stabilizing, and then we had a decent set of data. So I made a complete guess at 48 hours. So I thought the caravan might need, say, 24 hours to come up to temperature or to come down to temperature, depending on whether the heating was on or off, or to get to a steady state of humidity based on desiccator crystals or dehumidifiers, etc. So I guessed at 48 hours. That was a complete shot in the dark, so I have no idea if that was a reasonable guesstimate or not, or whether it was overkill or underkill. So what I'm going to do is, when we look at the data in a minute, then we're going to look at the second half of that, so the second 24 hours, before we say, oh, it's going up or it's going down in this scenario, because of course that first bit of time, then either it's got to stabilize down or stabilize upwards. So I have to be careful about what we say is meaningful. All right, so that is the major disclaimers. Of course, there'll be a few other bits that pop up, I'm sure, while I'm waffling through the results. Oh, and to add, before we get to results and process and so on, that the 48 hours per scenario, now there were 4 variables there, so that means of course there were 16 possible combinations, because I wanted to try each of the things on their own and each of the things in conjunction with the other things. So in some scenarios, there's just one intervention, so like windows closed or windows open. In other scenarios, there's windows closed, dehumidifier on, and then there might be windows closed, dehumidifier on, heating on. So you get the drift. There are lots of different scenarios, and 48 hours of each scenario adds up to a grand total of about 32 days and nights, obviously 32 separate periods. And the factor completely outside my control, obviously, is weather. So I wanted to keep the experiments fairly close together, so that time period, hopefully we didn't have too much sort of crazy long-term trends in terms of weather. So I ran all of these experiments in the period of, I guess it was mid-December, just before mid-December, the run up to Christmas, all the way over Christmas, and then through into mid-January. And I hoped that was a fairly stable part of the year in terms of weather. I gathered the temperature data as well, and we'll have a look at that as we go through. But that is the sort of time scale that I was talking about, and each of those were over 48 hours. Other things to point out is that this data was gathered mid-December 2020 through to January 2021. And here in the southeast, we were conveniently or not on absolute lockdown during that period in time. So the caravan didn't go anywhere. There was no chance of the caravan going anywhere. So there was no sort of external influence in terms of whether it had been used or not. And in fact, it hadn't been used since the October half term, because as soon as that was over, you probably remember there was this discussion of whether we have a fire break at the October half term or not, and we didn't. But fairly soon after the half term, then a lot of the country went back into level 4 lockdown and that sort of thing. So that's how the sort of experiment was planned out and how it took place. The caravan was left empty for a few weeks beforehand. I quite often like to come and have a cup of tea in here, and in fact I have one now because this is a lot of science experiment and data. But prior to doing all of this, the weather had turned a good month or so before, so I had stopped that little habit because I absolutely refused to come out and put the heating on just for a cup of tea, besides which it doesn't warm up in time anyway. So no heating on. The caravan should have been completely stable before we started, and hopefully I've minimized the effect of ambient weather. Now, in science, when we're doing an experiment, we try to only change one thing at a time, so the thing we call the variable. And the variable, of course, is the heating, dehumidifier, desiccant crystals, that sort of thing. Windows, ventilation. So those are our variables, and of course the weather is the one variable we can't control. So I'll tell you in a minute how I've tried to get around that, or at least minimize it in terms of the sensors. But if, having seen this, if one of the manufacturers wants to sponsor a vlog where they'll help me get some time at the Truma Climate Centre, that would be absolutely fantastic. And then not just to use the centre, obviously, for the extreme cold, which is what the manufacturers use it for, but actually the climate centre, or indeed a very temperature and humidity stable warehouse would do, actually. If we can keep a caravan in the same sort of environment externally, then that just reduces that variable, which makes the data that we're gathering about the actual variable of interest much more interesting and much more stable and much more reproducible, hopefully. So manufacturers, if you want to sponsor something, please step forward. Contact details below. Now then, last bit of data warning, etc. This is not a bish bash bosh do this opinion piece. This video has been set up as a gathering of data. It's a scientific experiment. This is not a shouty assertion of what my opinion is or isn't about this, because actually before I had the data I didn't have an opinion anyway. I didn't know what I was supposed to be doing. So it's very much a gathering of experimental data. It's a scientific approach to trying to work out whether anybody's right or wrong, or whether these things make no difference at all. So it's hardly any surprise that there are so many different opinions as there are parts of the country and different weather patterns that we find ourselves in. Anyway, so it's going to read much more like a science lab report than it is a bit of marketing fluff or instructional opinion piece. That's the way the video is going to work. If you're not interested in that, then by all means jump ahead to the results. That's fine. I'll try and stick some of the chapter headings below and the timings of those so you can just click through. and find yourself to the relevant bit. If you want to do that, you're perfectly welcome to, but please don't make a fool of yourself in the comments by going on about error bars or making some assertion that I've probably covered in another bit of the video. That's just a waste of everybody's time. Thanks so much. Okay. Anyway, obviously I hope you find it interesting, but there's chapter headings if you just want to get to the so what's. Anyway, let's go. So, experimental design. The things I've got control over are desiccant crystals, and I'm using one of these. This is an Aero 360. I've got a mini dehumidifier. This is mains powered, and the caravan's plugged in at home, so that's no problem at all. As I said, the heating, the Truma Combi 4E on its lowest setting, that's blown air heating, running on electric, and the windows are fully closed or on their latched open ventilation setting. In this caravan, the main part of this caravan, the downstairs, because it's a little bit different, there's a tour, linked to a tour above, if you wonder why on earth I'm going on about upstairs and downstairs. So the downstairs of the caravan is incredibly well ventilated. I've got vents under the seat at the front, so next to the battery compartment, and I've got another one in the floor under the bed at the back, and a big vent above the fixed bed at the back. So the downstairs is incredibly well ventilated, and all the furniture has U's cut out of the underneath so that the air can flow, and I'm careful to make sure that all of the things are packed in carefully so that we're not blocking those vents. Also, for the period of the experiments, all the soft furnishings were out and in the house, and the bed was left tilted up, so free flowing air around that section, and the vents and the seat boxes at the front here were left open as well. So everything was open, all the cupboard doors were open in the normal way that you're supposed to store your caravan. So that's the setup. And the other thing that I had to be really careful of was not adding any moisture to the air as the experimenter, so the person conducting the experiment. So I had a very clear protocol for swapping between different scenarios. So at 6 o'clock every evening, well, sometimes 5:45, sometimes 6:15, you know, life, work gets in the way, so it wasn't precisely 6 o'clock every day. Anyway, as close to 6 o'clock as I could manage. I told you this was amateurish, not professional science. Anyway, as close to 6 o'clock as I could manage every other day, so every 48 hours when the scenario switched, I opened the door, went straight in, took out whatever I needed to take out, or switch the heating on or whatever. I went straight out and shut the door. I should have mentioned I shut the door behind me, shouldn't I? So I opened the door, went in, shut the door, did whatever I need to do, open the door, out, shut the door. And tried to keep that time as minimal as possible, because obviously as humans we breathe out a huge amount of water vapor in the air that we're breathing, and especially if you're trying to get a move on with something, you might be breathing a bit more heavily than normal. So it was nice, calm, gentle, but rapid changeover as much as possible to minimize the impact of that. The other thing I did to minimise faffing was the first half of the experiments were carried out with the windows clipped closed, because that was the most time consuming thing to change. So I went through with windows closed and did dehumidifier, heating, desiccant crystals on all the combinations of those. And then the second phase was windows set to their vent setting, and then exactly the same protocols back through. So every scenario got tested. So that's not ideal, you know. In an ideal experiment, then we'd have automatic ways of turning things on and off, and automatic ways of emptying, removing the dehumidifier from the scene, because you don't just want to turn it off, but you want to take the whole thing out so that you don't have any excess liquid evaporating into the air. And the same is true for the desiccant crystals. So when they weren't needed, they were taken out completely and taken into the house, so that they were completely out the environment that we were gathering the data in. Now, as I said, the one thing I don't have control over is the weather, so what's going on outside. But I bought these sensors, and I bought 4 of them. As I said, they're available on Amazon. There's a link below if you want to pick up some of those. And if you do want to pick up some of those, I'd be incredibly grateful if you'd use the link, because it would be lovely to have your support, because it costs you exactly the same if you use the link, but we get a few p back from every sale, and it'd be very nice to offset some of the cost of making this video. So many thanks for your help if you decide to do that. Anyway, I picked them up on Amazon. As I said, they're really quite cool because you can talk to them by Bluetooth from your phone. So you just pair them with your phone, and you can see all the sensors at once. You can see
at any point in time exactly what the temperature is and the humidity is of that sensor, and you can drill down into each one and get the data itself that the sensor's been covering. I think it takes a data point once every 10 minutes, I can't remember. I'll put a banner in across the bottom of the screen here. So you can sit on your sofa, stand by your front door or whatever you want in the house and see exactly what's going on with the caravan. So that is really good. So here's a little close-up of the app screen itself, and you can see that not only can you see all the sensors themselves once you've logged multiple sensors into the app itself, but you can also give each one an individual photograph, so you can easily see where each one is. Otherwise, you know, who knows which little white box is which. You can give them a name. This is the latest upgrade to the app, so I have no idea why it's lost the names that I put on there, but it has, which is not very helpful. But the photo seems to be in the correct place because I put some physical lettering on the sensors themselves as well, so I could tell which was which. You can also locate it if you find it. You can press this little find button and it starts the thing beeping. That seems to upset the readings, but it soon goes back to where it should be. I guess it's just a battery usage issue. You can also calibrate them against each other, which is great. So obviously put them all together for a day or two, make sure they've equalized, and then set them against each other. And that's, you know, the point of what we were trying to do here, which was to look at differences, not absolute levels. So that is super as well. And there's quite a wide range of calibration there. And if you've got these things stored with your precious guitars or cigars or barrels of wine or whatever it is, then you can set limits, so high and low limits, and then your phone gets an alert if any of the sensors measures anything outside any of those limits. So, you know, for a little gadget off of Amazon, very impressed actually. And as I said, it can reach across the small driveway, albeit small, into the house, but it is transmitting from inside an aluminium sided box, so pretty impressive I think for what it is. So the other thing these sensors do is they don't need to be permanently linked to the phone, so you just Bluetooth into them whenever you want to see what it's reading, but they store on board their own data. So I think they store something like 100 days worth of data, and you can just hit the button and download that all in one go. So the data is supposed to come off in a CSV format, and it should be easy to just dump it into Excel. That was true for the humidity. For some reason there was something weird, there was some weird data artifact in the temperature, and it wasn't so easy to put into Excel as I thought it was going to be. Anyway, my darling husband sorted that out for me with his very good computer science skills, so thanks very much to him. So as I said, these things store the data on them. They store about 100 days worth, and the batteries are supposed to last for about a year. They're those button cell lithium things, so they're just a few quid each. And at the time of recording it, so it's now October 2021, and we've had these things for just under a year, I think, and 2 of them look like the batteries have failed, and 2 of them are still going strong. I'm going to do a few more experiments this winter, so I'll refresh all the batteries before I do that. But that year claim seems about right, because who knows how long they were sat around in the warehouse before they got to us. So as I said, I bought 4 sensors. The data in this video only comes from 2 of them. If you've been watching the channel for a while, or you own an Ariba Feeling, or you own a Hymercar with one of these sleeping roofs, then you'll probably know full well that they suffer terribly from condensation, especially in the UK, because the insulation in them in the top lid is absolutely appalling, and the ventilation is just as bad as well. I think the newer ones have got some vents in the rear, but those of us with older ones, Hymer has not bothered to reach out to us and try and put that corrective procedure in place, so we're all mightily annoyed. So the point of that little rant being, obviously we're very, very curious about what's going on upstairs in the bed section, and as a section of dead air effectively, what I wanted to know was, as I was doing these experiments downstairs, what on earth was going on upstairs in the bed section. So I put one of the sensors right at the back of the bed, which is completely dead air. There's no circulation up at that back end at all. And then one towards the front, where there should be a little bit of circulation from downstairs here up through the gap that there is between the roof and the bed surface. So that's where 2 of the sensors were, and the other 2 were running the data that we're going to have a look at in a moment. So the sensors themselves, you know, this is, as I said to you, this is not thousands of pounds worth of high-tech science equipment. This is just something from Amazon that's designed for wine barrels. Some of you may be familiar with wine barrels. Anyway, the accuracy that they claim is plus or minus half a degree C and plus or minus 5% relative humidity. So I'm pretty impressed actually with the temperature accuracy. So half a degree C is pretty good going for, you know, a little consumer type thing. But the plus or minus 5% relative humidity might give us some things that we need to be very wary about, because it depends from the data whether we're seeing really big differences or hardly anything at all. And if we're seeing anything that is, say, 10% difference, we can't say whether that's a real difference or not, because one sensor, for example, could be measuring 5% less than it should be, and the other one 5% more than it should be for exactly the same situation, and therefore anything up to 10% we cannot say is definitely a real thing. It might be, but we cannot be sure because of the error and the accuracy of these things, the instrumentation that we've got to work with. And we always have to remember that in science, that if we say something, we say 20 degrees, then the certainty with which we're saying that is, you know, we say 20 degrees, but we don't mean precisely 20 degrees. We mean probably 20 degrees, but somewhere at least in this region. And in this case, the region is 19.5 to 20.5 when we're talking about centigrade. And if we say 20% humidity, we actually mean it's somewhere between 15 and 25. So bear that in mind. I'll talk about that a lot more in more detail when we're talking about errors later on. But the take-home message to remember is that anytime we're talking about the differences between two sensors, the difference must be at least 1 degree C and at least 10% relative humidity. Otherwise, we can't say there's definitely a difference. So because of those accuracy issues, then we need to be looking for differences that are greater than 1 degree C or greater than 10% relative humidity to be certain that there's actually a difference. So just bear that in mind. All right, now this experiment is going on in the real world, which means we've got weather to contend with. And the way in which I got around that was by putting one of the sensors outside under the chassis, and I actually hung it off the chassis so that the temperature transferring through the metal chassis didn't influence what the sensor was reading. I hung it from a piece of paracord, which is nicely thermally insulating, so it was just hanging in the air under the chassis. I didn't want it too close to the underneath of the floor in case there was heat transferring through when it was heating on experiments that were then perturbing what was going on under there. And I also couldn't have it out in the open, first of all because I didn't want any sun shining on it, which would then influence what the result might be that the sensor was measuring. And secondly, these things are not weatherproof, so I didn't want any rain falling on it either, because that would have obviously soaked the thing through and shorted all the electronics, so we wouldn't have got very good results there either. The one that was inside the caravan I put on top of the toaster rack, and I decided that was probably the best place because it was closest to the centre of the caravan, so equidistant from any heater outlets, not in direct sun, and equidistant between the floor and the ceiling as well. So it was the closest place I could get it right to the centre, other than putting it on a tripod in the middle of the corridor. So that's where the centre one went for in here. So obviously the ideal situation would have been to have a number of sensors all over the caravan, both inside and outside, and then look at averages and different behaviours between those different sensors themselves to try and get a more stable result. And that would have helped to get away from this accuracy issue as well, because we would have been getting multiple readings, which would have been able to be triangulated towards a sort of more certain result. So the way of trying to get away from the influence of the weather is to, when we get to the data in a minute, subtract all the internal stuff from the external stuff. So we're actually looking at differences that are happening and differences between different scenarios to try and see if we can work out if one scenario is better than the other one. Anyway, one sensor outside, one sensor inside. What does the data look like? Let's get some graphs out. So read this graph using the left humidity axis for the blue outdoor readings and the red indoor ones, and then use the right hand axis for the purple lines, and the purple track is that difference line, so it's the outside subtracted from the inside humidity. So weirdly, the data is really noisy, or in plain English, it's very wiggly. So I was expecting the humidity to rise and fall fairly smoothly, but that doesn't look like it's the case. But if you remember that accuracy thing, it was plus or minus 5%. And of course, the way the data is reporting itself is down to 1%. So, for example, it's reporting 62, 63, rather than multiples of 5. So that's probably why we've got quite a lot of wiggle going on. But at least the little wiggles are well within those error bars, so I'm not too concerned about them, just surprised. Now, I'm only showing humidity here because although humidity varies with temperature, so let me just explain that. So if you've got 20 grams of water vapor dissolved in a cubic meter of air, so, you know, meter by a meter by a meter, so you've got 20 grams of water dissolved in that, and let's say it's 10 degrees C, then the relative humidity, so the humidity you measure, will actually be far, far higher than if you then raise exactly the same volume of air with exactly the same grams of water vapor in it up to 20 degrees C. Then the humidity will be much, much lower. And that's because warmer air can soak up, dissolve, however you want to say it, can take a lot more water vapor within it. And so the relative humidity is much lower with a higher temperature, even to the extent that, let's say you've got 30 grams of water dissolved in your cubic meter of air at a high temperature, it will still come out with a lower relative humidity than fewer grams dissolved in exactly the same volume of air at a lower temperature. So it can be a little bit mind-bending. So what we're talking about here is relative humidity, and that's the percentage of water vapor dissolved in the air that volume of air can take. So for example, if it's 20% relative humidity, then the air has a capacity of another 80% to absorb more water vapor at that fixed temperature. Does that make sense? It's a bit mind-bending. Anyway, people get lazy, including me, on this graph, as you can see, where I've just written humidity, but what we're actually referring to is relative humidity, or RH. And I've been sensible on the right-hand axis, haven't I? Because I've put difference in relative humidity, RH. Anyway, each green vertical bar represents a change in scenario, and then the letters in the boxes at the bottom signify which scenario we're talking about in that column. So in terms of coding, it's D for desiccant crystals, H for heating, U for dehumidifier, because I couldn't use D obviously, so dehumidifier, and W for windows. So that's windows cracked open. Where the windows were completely sealed closed, then I just didn't mention that within the box at the bottom. So the first thing to note is that the interior appears to be lower humidity almost all the time than the exterior, which is interesting. So there are a few spikes in interior humidity, many of which seem to fall on the green line, suggesting that despite my very quick no faff protocol, either I was breathing far more heavily than I thought I was and putting a lot more water vapor in the air, or perhaps just any small amount of water vapor from a human makes a massive difference, or quite possibly that the act of opening the door sort of whooshed in a whole load of more humid or wetter air from the outside. So, you know, you can see that a human inside the caravan for a minute or less is clearly visible, or this act of having to open the door twice is clearly visible. Sometimes the interior spikes coincide with an exterior humidity spike, and on this sort of scale, remember each column is 48 hours. On this sort of scale, it's quite likely that the door had to be opened during a rain shower or a drizzle or something, and I just kept really simple weather records rather than 24-hour minute by minute records. You know, I was trying to do paid work at the same time. And the next thing to note is that most of the time, we'll ignore the far right hand side set of scenarios for now, is that the interior humidity tracks the exterior humidity. So that's entirely reasonable. You know, it's a ventilated box after all, but there's a delay of about a few hours to sort of half a day or something, but sometimes it seems to track much quicker. And that's entirely reasonable and expected because the vents in the floor and the roof, keep a decent flow of air going on. So you would expect that if the outdoor got drier, then the indoors would get drier as well, but perhaps a little bit delayed, because you need the time for the motion of the air particles and the ventilation to flow through the space to make that happen. Now, if we switch to only looking at the purple line, this is where we need to be very careful. Bear in mind that each sensor has an accuracy of plus or minus 5%, so one could be measuring 5% low and the other 5% high, which means the maximum gap between those things could be accentuated by up to 10%. So in other words, anything showing a difference of less than 10%, we cannot categorically say is due to differences in the scenario. So anything between 0 and 10% we can't say is an actual real difference. And of course, if the difference here is showing as 20%, it may well be exactly 20%, but in reality it could well, given those error bars, be anything between 10% difference and 30% difference. So that is something we need to be very, very careful about. Now, while we're talking about error bars, one of the things I forgot to mention earlier is before I started all the experiments, I put all 4 of the sensors together and I left them sat on the front table here of the caravan for 24 hours. And I made sure that they were reading basically the same, to make sure we hadn't got a duff unit before we started measuring with it. And they all varied, and sometimes we were getting differences of 5% between the 4 of them. But they sort of wobbled up and down relative to each other when I came to check them every couple of hours for during the daytime, and then they'd all stabilize completely together by the end of that checking period. So I was confident that the sensors themselves were fairly even with each other, and at least would experience the same sort of errors, rather than having a duff one, for example, that would give us totally bum results and ruin the whole thing. So if we look really closely at this 0 scenario, so this is when the windows are tightly closed but there's nothing else happening in here, we can see that doing absolutely nothing still means the inside of the caravan is drier than the outside. Now, I don't quite understand that. Because of lockdown, as I said, the caravan wasn't used at all since the end of October, when it was October half term. And I hadn't been having my lovely restful cups of tea out here for peace and quiet, because it was far too cold and I refused to put the heating on for just 1 cup of tea. So the caravan was super stable. What I was expecting to happen was the outside thing to sort of go up and down and up and down and up and down. And I was expecting the caravan to follow it, but less so. So when the caravan shot up in temperature and so on, I was expecting the caravan to do this. And so I was expecting a bit of this, but I wasn't expecting warmer all the time, because it's been sat in the outside world for a couple of months. So I was expecting the average to be exactly the same, but that's not what we can see in this data. So that's quite interesting. I suppose, thinking about it logically, it's probably down to the materials that are in the caravan. So the caravan is skinned, this one's skinned in aluminium and a bit of GRP in the front and the back, and then the inside is wood. So we've got wooden wall panels, so all this sort of stuff, the wall panels here, this is all paper coated ply, but then there's an awful lot of polyisocyanate foam inside, and this is all blown into place in the factory, so they're not cut as separate panels. I think it's all assembled and then blown through whatever the Heimer PUAL system is. PUAL? Anyway, that's how Heimer make them. But there's not, moss, there's not porous paving, there's not bits of soil all around, so there's nothing that when it rains, there's nothing that absorbs the moisture and then releases that as moisture into the atmosphere through evaporation and that sort of thing. So maybe it's not unreasonable that it was drier in here, but I find it surprising. Anyway, that was interesting. So the other thing to bring in at this point, of course, is temperature. I think that would be quite interesting. So here's the temperature chart in case it tells us anything useful. Again, it's blue for the outside and red for the inside, both again red off the left hand set of axes, and purple for the difference, red off the right hand set of axis. And this is also pretty fascinating. You can see the red internal, well, if you're interested in that sort of thing, you can see the red internal temperature following the blue outside temperature. So that is exactly as I would expect it to do. So it rises and falls, but a little bit delayed, so slightly offset from the outside temperature by a couple of hours. So entirely expected. That's precisely what I would expect to happen. You know, it takes a while for the bulk of the caravan. You know, it's full of materials for the caravan itself and all the stuff inside it. So it takes a couple of hours for all that sort of materials to warm up and to cool down. But weirdly, there are quite a few occasions where the caravan seems to dip lower than the outside world does. And I don't quite understand why that's the case. I guess perhaps that is something to do with the fact that the sensor that's on the outside is under the chassis. So if there's a wind chill going on or something like that, perhaps the caravan is wet on the outside and then the wind starts up. So perhaps there's a wind chill factor going on that wouldn't affect the sensor underneath so much. Or in terms of temperature, you know, the windows in this thing mean that it acts like a bit of a greenhouse. So obviously it gets a lot warmer inside here than it does under the caravan. So perhaps some days it holds on to more of that heat because it comes in through the windows and then is well insulated in terms of the isocyanate foam in the walls and so on. But that's a bit of a mystery. So it's interesting here as well because you can see very, very clearly when the heating's on. And of course in those cases, you know, it's interesting to see how rapidly it gets up to temperature. And it's about 12 degrees C seems to be for the lowest setting on the heating. And that seems pretty consistent, so I'm very happy about that. So as I said, I just set the Truma Combi boiler. It's the 4E that we've got in this one. It's just a little caravan, so it just needs the little number 4. Well, not so little, but little relative to the size of these things. So that was just set on the lowest possible setting. And then the wiggles that you see in the data from when the heating is on are, of course, the thermostat turning on and off. So that's good. And then there was one scenario where the heating was supposed to be on, but because it was already over that temperature inside and stayed over that temperature day and night, then the heating didn't actually kick in. So if you look closely at that one, remember that I was changing scenarios at about 6 o'clock each evening. So the warm bits are actually during the night. And then looking back quickly at my weather forecasting, my weather noting spreadsheet, then when I did the HU scenario, so heating and dehumidifier, then it was almost exclusively collected during what I've noted was drizzle and gloom, followed by, as you can see, a rapidly descending blue line by a lovely sunny but absolutely freezing cold couple of days. So let's go back and look at that humidity data, but bearing in mind the temperature stuff, because of course temperature is completely correlated with relative humidity. So any effects might just be down to what's going on with the temperature outside the caravan. All right, so we already know that if we've got a fixed volume of air, so we've got a fixed meter cube, for example, with a certain number of grams of water dissolved in it, we already know that if the temperature of that fixed volume of air with a fixed volume of water in it goes down, then the relative humidity that we measure goes up, because the ability of that volume of air to hold that particular set volume of water vapor decreases. So the relative humidity is a measure of the amount of water that fixed volume of air can hold at that particular temperature. But of course, in the real world, we do not have fixed volumes of air, and we do not have fixed volumes of water vapor dissolved in them. So we don't have that theoretical perfectness. We have weather. And let's have a look at what the weather shows us. So if we lay the temperature chart over the humidity chart, it becomes blooming obvious which are the clear cold days and which are the gloomy, drizzly, damp ones. Quite clear, isn't it? So if you look at just the blue external data, so ignore the red internal and the purple different stuff. So looking at just the blue external data, you can see that, quite interestingly, that it really wasn't that cold last winter. It's only here that the external temperature really gets down to about freezing, and this is mid-January time, or just below freezing. And that's the day the temperature inside the caravan actually went lower than the temperature outside, which is very interesting indeed. Although bearing in mind outside is measured underneath the chassis, so it's quite possible that that's quite a sheltered area, and so it doesn't suffer from the same sort of wind chill that the caravan does stood out in the open. But look here and here and here, so these are rapidly falling temperature days, which were also clear and dry, I've noted in the weather log. And then look at the relative humidity, so that falls as well quite rapidly in line with the temperature at the same time. Here in the coldest parts of the experiment, this is early to mid-Jan, it's both cold but also overcast. So the temperature is low, but the relative humidity is still pretty high. And that correlates with the weather log, so I've noted these days as overcast or sometimes a bit misty, but cold. So not particularly sunny, but definitely cold, and slightly gloomy, but not drizzly or raining or anything like that. So let's just pause and sum up what we've thought and what we've concluded so far before we start ploughing on and looking at the data in more detail to see if there's anything we really should be doing. So I think the key points at this point are that the temperature in the caravan really, really well tracks the external temperature. I'm quite surprised how closely they track, actually. Assuming you haven't got heating on, of course, so internal temperatures really well tracking the external temperature. And point B, the inside of the caravan is drier almost all the time. I suspect they're just odd points or middle-aged women breathing when they're trying to change experiments. So the inside of the caravan is always drier than the outside. And C, the real humidity actually tracks really quite closely the external humidity. So the internal humidity in the caravan, although it's offset and always lower, it is tracking the external humidity really quite closely most of the time. And perhaps that's not surprising in a well-ventilated box that stood in the outside world all the time. But it does closely track what's going on there. Now, having made those three conclusions, the next thing we need to look at is then, okay, within that tracking of the humidity, is there anything, any sort of intervention which is a positive benefit in terms of what we could think about doing to keep the inside of the caravan drier? Or, of course, is there something that we shouldn't be doing? So are there situations where we're actually making the world of the inside of the caravan worse? Or is Mother Nature so all-powerful that there's no point doing anything at all? So let's get into the data, look much more closely, and see if we can see any meaningful differences in the internal humidity versus the external relative humidity. Okay, let's go. All right, so our basic question is, are any of these interventions better than doing nothing? Or possibly worse than doing nothing, of course. So we need to give ourselves a baseline, so a point from which we start that is normal. So in other words, it really doesn't matter what the actual numbers are. What matters is the relative behaviour during each of the individual scenarios, and whether they're different, whether they're much better or in fact worse than doing nothing. That's the key question for practical everyday caravanning guidance that we need to know. Now, one limitation of this experiment, as we talked about earlier, of course, is that each combination was only run once, and that includes the doing nothing scenario. So I did try and run it towards the middle of the set of experiments in the hope that any longer term variations in weather would be ironed out by trying to do it in that midpoint. But still, you know, like any of the other scenarios, it was only run once, which leaves us open to weird aberrations in the sensors or something happening outside, which then perturbs the results and then gives the baseline against which we're trying to measure all of our different changes, skews that a little bit. So we need to bear that in mind. You know, in a proper, robust scientific study, we would have run each of the scenarios 3 times, so we'd have a set of results that we could then look for consistency and check that the results we're getting are actually real results rather than something screwy is going on with the sensor, that sort of thing. So we have to be very careful of that, and we have to bear in mind that this is a first attempt. You know, I'm sharing a first go at trying to develop this sort of evidence and to gather this sort of data. And that then helps us to focus down on the things that are most interesting and not waste time on the stuff that clearly is already not making much of a difference. So that said, regard everything I say in this video very much as indicative rather than gospel. But it will be interesting, won't it, that on the scenarios that look like they're not making much difference at all, that's probably the stuff that people are arguing about the most, because there's not a lot to be seen there. Anyway, that said, in the zero scenario, the humidity itself settles quite nicely down into a fairly level 85-ish% value in the second of the 24-hour periods. If we look at the purple line though, the data gets much messier, because of course the outside is wobbling around through a whole different set of humidities that are going on out there. So we can see that in the second period, the inside was much drier than the outside by about 12%, and that was reducing over time. So before we move on, here's another interesting thing to note, and that's how this internal RH, so internal relative humidity, wiggles as the thermostat switches on and off. That's interesting, isn't it? So if you look at it, the heating is only varying by about 1 degree between that switch on, switch off point. But look at that humidity, it's oscillating up and down by 5%. So that's within our sensor error range, of course, but it's not happening everywhere, is it? Look at the data and how it flows, and it's only in those periods where the heating's on that it's going up and down. So whilst these sensors are labelled as plus or minus 5 degrees accurate, the fact that it's only doing that when the heating is on rather than the whole trace would suggest we're getting a pretty stable result there. So I'm not concerned that the sensor itself is just wiggling around this plus minus 5 degrees. It may be that the line itself is plus or minus 5 degrees relative to where in reality the actual reading is, but the sensor itself is not wobbling, so at least we're getting a consistent change over time. So one thing we can do without ruining our data too much to try and smooth it out, to try and get a more useful way of looking at it, is to plot rolling averages. And of course everybody will be much more familiar with rolling averages, having just come through a year and a half, heading for 2 years, I guess, of pandemic, and the way the data is presented there in terms of rolling averages. So this raw data was gathered at 1 point per 10 minutes, so 6 points an hour. And if we just take a 10-point rolling average, then that smooths the data out over, say, 100 minutes. And that gives us a slightly smoother line to work with. So let's look at desiccator crystals first. And from all the scenarios involving those, let's see if we can see any real differences relative to that baseline. And here I'm not just looking for positive differences, but of course I'm looking for negative too, because a lot of the discussion is, yes, they're useful, no, they don't do anything, and some people even say actually they're adding more liquid into the atmosphere. Now, let's have a look at the data and see what's happening rather than bringing in opinion. So remember, we're always comparing what we're doing with doing nothing. So looking at the trends, both for the actual values and for the differences outside. These things are rough trends during the second 24-hour period of each. So if we just try and draw some rough trends on for the second 24-hour period of each of those scenarios, that will give us a good enough indicator relative to the quality of the experiment we're trying to do. So if we look at the raw data, the red line of the internal humidity is about 84% in the do nothing scenario, but in all the others is actually lower than that. So, but remember, we need to allow for two very pesky things, and the first of those is this plus or minus 5% accuracy claim of the sensors, and it's what's happening with the external weather, of course, because we've already shown there's a very close correlation between what's happening outside and what's happening inside. So is it the case that on the days that the desiccator happened to be in one of the scenarios, it was drier outside anyway, which then encouraged it to be drier inside? So for the plus minus 5% sensor issue, we know that anything within that range can't be categorically declared as a significant difference. But we're better off really trying to look at the internal and external differences anyway. But we have to remember that we need to say only differences above 10% meaningful anyway in terms of being categorically correct given the error bars of the sensors that we have. So if we draw a plus minus 10% box around the zero scenario, then anything inside that box might be a difference, but we can't categorically say it is scientifically proven because of the error bars that we have to build into every experiment. It might be, but even if it's only plus or minus 10%, then potentially it's not a very real or meaningful difference anyway. So the only things all or partially outside the box are desiccant in conjunction with heating, or heating and window vents and a dehumidifier. So it doesn't look to me as if desiccant on its own is doing anything useful. If we go back to this comparison, the desiccant on its own did actually give a drier internal atmosphere than the do nothing scenario, but it was a much drier day outside, so by the time the weather's been taken into account, it's actually relatively more humid inside than the do nothing scenario. But you know, all of this stuff is so close to the do nothing scenario, then I don't think we can say anything meaningful here, because it's well within the errors extremes of the experiment. So we can't really say that it's doing something, but also we can't really say that it's doing anything bad either, which I suspect means it's doing nothing whatsoever. So remember, all of these results are from my caravan stored on my drive in the southeast, and the sort of weather we experience, which is not particularly cold. It's quite wet, but it's not particularly blowy or cold or any of those sort of things. So these results are gathered very much in my environment, and given what I said about Mother Nature being very powerful here relative to anything we're trying to do, then I suspect you'll get quite different results depending on where you store your caravan. So if it's at the top of a northern hill somewhere that is always blowing a gale, then you probably have really good ventilation going through it, relative to it being somewhere that's much wetter and more tropical and so on, in which case you might have more problems with dew points and condensation and so on. So having said it doesn't look like desiccated crystals are doing anything, and therefore people saying you definitely must have them are talking rubbish, but equally people saying that they make the interior of the caravan more damp are talking rubbish. You know, there's no doubt that the crystals themselves are doing something. You know, they're definitely pulling dampness out of the air, because otherwise you wouldn't get liquid in the bottom of the crystal itself. But they're not doing anything extra to keep the inside of the caravan dry. So all the liquid they pull out of the air is very simply and quickly and easily replaced through the vents in the caravan itself. Now, if you happen to own a caravan that is very badly ventilated and possibly very badly insulated as well, then they may well make a much bigger difference. So next, let's apply the same sort of analysis principles to the experiments with the dehumidifier in. And first off, we'll start with dehumidifier and heating, and let's see whether that makes any difference or not. Let's get into the data. So in the raw data, the relative humidity descends pretty rapidly actually, and then tends to head back up a bit, mirroring what's happening on the outside, but say 12 hours later. So I guess it must have been a very dry day out there after a damp first night, and then gradually worsening again through the night and then the following day. So that all shows up in the differential data, of course, shooting up a bit first, not because it's actually going up, but because of the outside situation, but because of the outside environment. And then we see that the interior is a little bit below and then falling rapidly, suggesting that actually something useful is happening. But as soon as the heating is switched off, then the internal humidity stays pretty stable actually, whilst the external wiggles up and down. You'll have noticed the little F just at the bottom here, and that signifies a fundamental flaw with using this style of powered dehumidifier on its own in the winter, and that's that it freezes. So I suspect it stops it from doing anything useful. Okay, so here's what the dehumidifier looked like at the end of this scenario, this running of this particular setup. It's still running, the water's still coming through, but it's well on the way to being iced up. I left it running like that for the next scenario because this is supposed to be real life science, of course, and that's exactly what would happen. So, you know, we don't want to perturb the results in any way. though I suspect for the second of the scenarios it was running at a reduced capacity. After the desiccant dehumidifier scenario, I brought the dehumidifier into the house and it looked like this. So you can see ice forming here at the base of the cooling fin. And these things work by having a fan passing over the metal cooling baffles, so somewhat like the reverse of a radiator would. And these fins get cold, so any water in the atmosphere then condensates on those cold fins, exactly in the same way that you know, if you take a single skin water bottle full of cold water out into a very humid damp summer day, then you start to get water from the damp humid air condensating on your water bottle. So this works in exactly the same way, and then the water drips down through the baffles of the cooling fin and then into the reservoir at the bottom. And then there are these clever little clips which, as the float in the reservoir pushes up as it gets fuller and fuller of water, then they just push the clips and that clicks the switch off. So that is how this particular style of dehumidifier works. And then of course leave it for a few hours and it's all melted and back to normal. So as you can see here, it doesn't have to be freezing in the caravan for this thing to actually start freezing. You know, it cools pretty well. It cools those fins pretty well to the extent that it starts to form ice. Obviously only the fins have to be at freezing point, 0 degrees C. And so while the fan keeps on turning and keeps on cooling the blades, then just gradually the ice dam builds up from the bottom, because cold air always sinks, so it's always the coldest part that starts the ice forming, so the ice just gradually moves up and up and up. And that certainly doesn't stop the fan from moving and cooling the fins, but it does start to block the ability of the thing to drip through. And so if you just leave it going, you get ice further and further up, and it's coming out the front and presumably up at the top at some point, because the fans are going and keeping everything cold. So dehumidifier on its own looks hardly any different from doing nothing at all, and that's the whole point of the experiment. What's different to not putting any interventions in at all, even when it's not frozen? But maybe, just maybe, it does do something in conjunction with the heating. So there's a couple of tantalizing little results here which suggest there is something going on, but they're in conjunction with big dips in the outside humidity, so it's a little bit difficult to separate those two things out from the data I've got so far. Ventilation, and remember I said that the ventilation intervention was done by managing the windows. So instead of having the windows completely closed, then they were on their first catch setting, the same sort of way that you'd have it set up if you were using the caravan to make sure there was a ventilation going around the thing all the time. So this is in addition to the built-in ventilation that's under the box seat that I'm sat on now, under the bed at the back, and the big vent up in the roof over the back bed, and that's a permanent vent. It's not a skylight, it's a roof vent that's there all the time, and so keeping the entire caravan really well ventilated at all seasons, all times of day and night in the spring, summer, autumn and winter. So let's consider window ventilation, and then the last thing we'll think about is the heating, and look more in detail at that. There are two very clear phases to this experiment. So the first phase with all the windows clipped on their very tight closed normal travel settings, and then phase 2 with them all on the ventilation settings, and that enables us to very quickly and easily draw some pretty crude average behaviour patterns to be able to look at the data in the two phases next to each other. So let's do that. So remember that the way in which this experiment was done relative to things I've done in the past is very, very slapdash when it comes to proper science and proper robustly controlling the variables. This is being done in the real world to try and develop some evidence as to what we should be doing in the real world rather than under properly controlled conditions, so we know what the theoretical behaviour is in ideal conditions. Anyway, because it's quite slapdash, then I'm fairly relaxed about trying to draw some broad averages out across this data to see if it tells us anything meaningful. So if we take all the windows closed scenarios over just this 2-week-ish period, we see that it got slightly more humid, both externally and internally. So both getting more humid, but less of an increase inside, meaning the difference actually was increasing. So the inside was getting drier than it would otherwise be expected to be given the outside conditions. Now the data also looks more stable, but it's probably perturbed by a couple of nice, relatively dry days here. So we don't have beautiful, straight, little varying changes of data. There's actually some quite big dips there, which will be perturbing our results a little bit. And overall, the 2 weeks at the start of January looked much drier overall, so lower humidity. But in all the scenarios, not involving heating, it does look like the inside of the caravan is wetter than it would otherwise be with the windows closed. So, you know, not a huge difference there. So not something that we can say is categorically making a massive difference, but it certainly hints at that in this set of data anyway. So not surprising really, because of course by having the windows on their vent catches, that was adding a lot more ventilation to the caravan and encouraging a lot more of the external air in, be that wet, yucky air or nice dry air. So one would expect a lot more variability in what's happening with the humidity itself. Right, last one, let's have a look at heating, and there were some hints about this earlier in the data, so let's try and work out if these are actually true or whether there's not really anything going on here. So also you'll have noticed in terms of the order in which I undertook the scenarios that the heating scenarios are back to back. So that was done on purpose because I was a little concerned before I started out that if I put the heating on, that would then encourage more damp air from the outside to come in, because the inside was less damp, and then you would have, well, the word is equilibrium. So you would have the outside air rushing in to try and equalize with the inside air in terms of humidity, even though the temperatures were very different. So I was a little concerned that if I ran the heating for 2 days, the air got equalized in terms of humidity, which of course means for warmer air there's actually more water in it, so there's more grams of water vapor. So I was concerned if that happened and then the heating got switched off, then we would find ourselves with a much damper than expected following scenario. So in determining the order in which I took the scenarios, I tried to put all the heating ones together. Now, if that was the case, and if that was actually what was happening, we would, I think, expect to see a spike in the internal humidity in the hours or the day or so on after a heating scenario had been run, but the scenario at the time was a non-heating scenario. Now, there's mixed evidence as to whether this actually happened or not. So we only have 2 occasions within this data set where the cold scenarios directly followed on from heating scenarios. So the first one is with the windows fully closed, and it looks from this data pretty stable in the hours after the heating was switched off. But when the windows were on their vent settings, that's the second scenario and the second occasion that this happened on, it looks like there may well have been a spike directly after the heating was switched off. Perhaps not surprising given the extra ventilation that was available in the caravan at the time. So it may be that there was a lot more transfer going on, and of course I haven't measured that independently, I've just assumed it was happening. So it may be that because of the much more many more air exchanges that were happening with the windows on their vents, then indeed a lot more damp air did come in. I suspect the practice of popping up to the storage yard to switch the heating on for an hour or 2 and then leaving it all shut up again isn't, logically, to my mind, doesn't seem the best way of doing it. If you run it on low constantly, if you happen to be plugged in, then that feels more like a possibility. But I think this idea of switching it on for a short time, to my mind, is a no-no. But there's no conclusive evidence here, so that's heading back into speculation and opinion, which is not what this video is about. Now, there are 2 things actually conflated in the heating here, both of which are useful to what we're trying to do in terms of keeping the inside of the caravan drier than the outside. And that's that I used the built-in Trimmer Combi 4E. So I use that heating system on its lowest setting. Apparently one can have a frost protect element, and I'm not sure if we've got that, so I just put it down on the lowest setting, which at the time I didn't know what it returns, but as we can see here, it keeps the caravan at about 12 degrees. So that was being used as a heat source, but of course it's a blown air system, so it isn't just providing heat, it's also circulating the air around. There's the whole blown air system. We've got a vent down the front under the table here. We've got another vent by the door. We've got another vent up on the top of the cupboard to go upstairs. There's another one in the washroom, or if you haven't shut the vent properly, otherwise known as the sauna. It gets so hot in there. It's a tiny, tiny space. It's got its own vent. And then another one at the back in front of the bed. And in fact, there's a whole system that goes around the back at the bed. So it's just the ordinary tube with some cuts in it, so that the bed at the back is gently heated all the way around. So there are many outlets in this heating system, and quite a big heating system for quite a tiny space. So in terms of having everything set correctly, the vent that's on the top of the bed I had completely closed because the roof was down, and the one in the washroom I had at least 3/4 closed, because otherwise it just gets like a sauna. It's really bad in there. So I tried to use the vent covers to be able to manage the output and to try and keep a nice even heat all the way throughout the caravan. But of course they were blowing as well, which meant as well as heat there was air being moved around, and this increasing the flow through and ventilation of air in here. So looking at these traces one by one, we've got the outside humidity rising while inside it stays pretty stable. So the difference obviously is improving if you subtract one of those from the other. Then outside is rising again, but from a relatively dry point. And remember that I'm focusing here on the second half of each scenario. So I'm giving it 24 hours to gain some sort of steady state, some sort of stable condition from that particular scenario. Rather than looking at the whole thing, because obviously one has to give the scenario a chance to stabilize. And then again, it's relatively improving here. Then it's basically the same behavior again for just heating, although at the end of this period, as it's at the time that it's 100% humidity outside, the inside is then creeping back up again. So all of that's with the windows closed, and remember the entire point of this experiment is to compare it with doing nothing. So all of those 3 lines were with the windows closed, and then here's what happens with doing nothing. And then the last of the windows closed scenarios here again is really wet outside, and inside is fairly level and steady. So potentially, you know, we have a difference here with both the heating and the dehumidifier. Really, I have to say at the outset, I expected the heating to make a lot more difference in terms of the results that we were picking up from the heating related scenarios. There are 2 outliers at the end here, which we'll come and talk about in a minute. But overall, you know, we see this, it's possibly better than the rest, but perhaps not as much as I was expecting. You know, perhaps that's not surprising because, you know, the heating was just on the minimum setting, which kept it at 12 degrees. So comparing that to the sort of steady state in here, it wasn't that much warmer than it would otherwise be, other than, of course, when it dipped down to freezing point and got very chilly in here. But there are some very impressive falls, though unfortunately in terms of being categorical from these experiments, they seem to fall right when there's an impressive fall outside in the humidity, which isn't very helpful, so means that's not likely to be a particularly useful or interesting result, in the sense that it's not likely to be actually caused by the intervention if it's falling at exactly the same time as the external air is falling. And we've already seen, you know, how impressive Mother Nature is at controlling these things anyway, so perhaps that is a much bigger factor. So there are some interesting points at the end here though, which look a bit like outliers, but you know, the internal humidity is falling rapidly when the outside is pretty stable. So it may be that there's something in this, and it's just started raining. Yeah, that's good for talking about dry days and filming vlogs about condensation, isn't it? Anyway, excuse any raindrops on the roof of the caravan. Anyway, the scenarios with the windows closed happen to fall in line with dry days outside, which makes it very difficult to say if there's actually anything real happening here. But when we look at the windows on their vent settings, then actually we've got massive falls in internal humidity over here. And the last one particularly, the outside humidity was beautifully stable, so sort of floating around the 90% mark, so up and down a few percent, but relatively level rather than big peaks or troughs that we saw in the other scenarios. So let's look across here and look at all these scenarios compared to doing nothing. So doing nothing seems to have about an 8%-ish difference in terms of internal humidity, and internal humidity being drier than the outside. So looking across all these heating scenarios, so they seem to fall around the sort of 16, 17, 18%-ish mark, until the last ones, which are way up around 30, 35-ish in terms of difference. So, 16, 17, 18, we need to bear in mind our stipulation that any intervention has to be at least 10 percentage points better than doing nothing to be considered a meaningful and significant result. So because of those sensor accuracy issues, then we can't categorically say there is something in the other scenarios, but when it's up around 25, 30, I think we can say that potentially there is something there. But given that this is all preliminary data, and given all the limitations I've talked about in terms of the experimental design and the things we have to bear in mind, then I'd be very nervous about saying at this point in time there is definitely something there. It does, though, give us something interesting to look at this coming winter in terms of focusing down on a couple of scenarios and then being able to run multiple experiments to try and repeat the results. Because if we can't get repeatable results, then it just means there was some sort of random fluke in the sensor or something weird going on in the caravan that meant we got that result. If we can get repeatable results across doing the intervention multiple times, and then we can get fairly stable results, we know there's something there, even if it's a relatively small difference that's happening. So let's draw all this stuff together. I'm pretty sure what this data is showing us is that desiccant crystals on their own are absolutely useless. They're not beneficial, and neither are they causing anything bad either. Likewise, so is a dehumidifier running on its own, because in the sort of temperatures we experience in the UK, then it soon ices up, which I suspect renders it at least less efficient and maybe not effective at all. So what looks like it might give us a measurable and meaningful difference, not necessarily a huge difference, but a measurable and meaningful one scientifically, is running the blown air heating. And could that be down to heat? Could that be down to the extra ventilation of the blown air system? I'm not able to switch them independently, so I can only change that by adding in a little separate heater and seeing what that does. But anyway, possibly that in conjunction with a dehumidifier, because of course that means the dehumidifier doesn't freeze over. But a lot of these scenarios coincided with spikes in dry, lovely weather, which means the data coming from this experiment, so all the different scenarios, is a little bit sketchy in terms of categorically saying, yes, this is definitely happening. Not only that, but what is the cost of running the heating in these sort of weather conditions? And for the caravan owners, does the cost of doing that, even if they can do it because they happen to be able to plug in their caravan, does the cost then justify the difference in humidity that can be achieved on the inside of the caravan? So in low power mode, this Truma 4E claims to be 900 watts. So in mains power, that's 3.9 amps for the element, and possibly 0.4 amps of 12 volts to run the blowers. And that's when it's running. Obviously there's a thermostat, so it kicks in and kicks out depending on when the thermostat tells it to. And interestingly, my sensor is right there. Can you see that? Yes. So that's where the thermostat sits for hours. And obviously you know, that controls it all the time depending on what the outside ambient temperature is. So it's not using constantly 900 watts. There didn't seem to be any data on typical usage given external weather conditions, so I did a little bit of measuring. I measured exactly what the caravan was using by putting one of these little measuring blocks between the caravan plug and the wall socket that it was drawing from. So these things are another data gathering thing. It logs all the data that it's using and then Bluetooth to your phone to tell you what it is. So not only is there the 900 watts of the element for the heating system, but of course there's the dehumidifier running as well. I think off the top of my head that's about 35 watts. So as you can see here, for those mid-January experiments, we got through 43.74 kilowatt hours of power. So that's just running across those 3 or 4 days, I think it is, at 17p per kilowatt hour, let's assume. Might be even more by the time this video comes out, even though it's not that long between editing and uploading. Anyway, that's £7.44. But remember that the heating scenarios were only running on the 5th, 6th, 7th and 8th of January when it was quite chilly outside. So obviously that massively determines how much power the heating system is actually using. You know, so cold outside, then the heating system would have basically been running quite a lot, obviously, to maintain that 12 degrees inside. So if we assume something like 20 to 25 kilowatt hours per 24-hour period to run the system, which is a lot, but it's in that sort of freezing late January, early February period, that comes down to 425 per day. Which for a day or two, you know, is fine, but it soon adds up if you're running it for a month or more than that, and starts to become, well, personally I think unaffordable, but others will have their own opinions. So to sum up, running the heating possibly in conjunction with the dehumidifier looks like it may make a bit of difference in terms of the interior relative humidity of the caravan, but is doing it worth the cost for the improvement you get versus the cost that it will cost to run the thing, not just in power, but obviously in using the heating system, which presumably hastens the point at which that would need replacing? Or is Mother Nature so all-powerful that we might as well just capitulate and leave Mother Nature to her thing? Unlike our German and Dutch caravanning friends, of course, who have all these winter storage halls for their Wohnwagens. So they just go and park their caravans inside these huge warehouses, protecting them from the worst of the weather. So in terms of follow-ups, you know, I'm going to try and rerun the heating versus no heating scenarios. And as I said, I'll try and run them repeatedly. So I've got data for longer periods of time, but also multiple sets of data with exactly the same scenario. So we can look for some sort of consistency between them. But this year, trips are taking priority. So no promises that may or may not happen around wanting to actually use the thing. And I mentioned earlier that I would love to do this in a properly controlled environment. So if anyone wants to partner up and sponsor and join in to help do that, then there's contact details below. And likewise, I would love to be able to experiment with a proper breathable cover to see if that's actually helping with the humidity in here as well. That would be really interesting. So do get in touch if you can help make that happen. That would be fantastic, without, of course, interfering with any of the scientific or editorial control. That stays mine all the time. Well, all right, dear viewers, that is it. And thanks so much for sticking around to the end. You know, this was designed to be a scientific contribution to the community, I guess, not a sort of jolly, quick, happy, clappy, sort of wonderful trip. Nevertheless, I hope it was interesting, informative. It was interesting to watch the process go through. And of course, if you have spotted anything that I've missed, or I've got something wrong, you're an expert in the field, please do stick comments below, because I would absolutely love to hear those. And likewise, if anything wasn't explained perfectly clearly, then pop a question below. I'm quite happy to receive those. Do also find a suitable emoji and award yourself a medal for getting to this point in the video. All right, well, thanks for tuning in, and I guess I'll see you in the next one. So bye for now. See ya. A bit more about it in a minute. We'll let the bin men go past first. Still going. The whole ground shook then. Did you guys shake? Alright, great job. We're back to clean and tidy, so thanks to them. And no chucking stuff everywhere, which is perfect. Thank you very much. Okay, so